I think that finding the answer to the origin of COVID would not be as damaging to science and to international relations as failing to find that answer. A more complete understanding of the origins of COVID-19 clearly serves the interest of every person in every nation on this planet. It will limit further recriminations and diminish the likelihood of conflict. It will lead to more effective responses to this pandemic, as well as efforts to anticipate and prevent the next one. Thankfully, it seems more and more scientists are shifting their positions to agree that a laboratory leak hypothesis must be properly investigated at the very least to set a precedent. Despite representing a wide spectrum of opinions on the likelihood of a laboratory leak as the cause of the pandemic, many scientists have united to write open letters calling for a credible and rigorous investigation of both natural and lab-based origin hypotheses. Indeed, the growing calls for an investigation have stimulated renewed conversations around the types of pathogen research being conducted around the world and what scientists can do to make this research safer. How COVID will continue to evolve in terms of deadliness and transmissibility between humans and other animal hosts remains to be seen. But we do know one thing: the virus is here to stay, making any credible knowledge as to its origins all the more critical. Find out more on Emir Phillips' American Pragmatist.
Ignoring all of the remedies, believing all of the rumors, with their endless database. I wanna sit with my enemies and say we should have done this sooner, while I look them in the face. Maybe that will crack the case.
Hello, my name is Levi Mock, graduate of Valparaiso University with a degree in International Relations, International Business, as well as Film and TV Essential Certification out of New York University. You brought me in for a very, I would say, kind of controversial topic, but I'm interested to see what's going on with it. So I just need to know really quick, what kind of drew you to this specific topic?
Well, it was an article. It was a journal article I read in 2020 that came to the stark conclusion that argued that by the time SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, and if I do say in this podcast SARS-CoV-2, I mean COVID-19. That's more the the term of virologist, but it was first detected in late 2019, as we know.
Yeah.
But what was odd here, it was already pre-adapted to human transmission to an extent that was similar to late epidemic SARS-CoV 2003, SARS 2003 epidemic. And so we're going to post so the viewers can see the specific article.
Okay.
And the article was, SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 is well adapted for humans. What does that mean for reemergence? And there's the authors. And that was the article that really triggered the podcast.
All right, that sounds pretty interesting, man. I'm into it. I'm into it. So there's a lot to talk about here, but I guess I need to ask, because I'm sure it's very extensive. So what is the gist of this article? What's in a very succinct manner?
Well, I mean, the core thing that provoked me was the fact that COVID-19 was already pre-adapted to human transmission to an extent similar to late epidemic SARS, COVID 2003. And the significance is this: it probably means there was something oddly unique about COVID-19, or that it had been doctored up in a lab with prior mutations already passed and done with.
Would you say this article is reputable?
Dr. Zan was an expert on genomic analysis, and the other two authors were specialists in viral vector engineering at the elite Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. So I'd say this involved a careful, reputable study, peer-reviewed, and since I've read it, it has been cited in the scientific community at least 58 times.
All right, I would say it's nothing to sneeze at, but I mean that kind of begs the thought that, if that's true, I mean that COVID-19 was evolving more slowly than what normally occurs when a virus of this type, one that's recently embedded in a human species, coming from an animal source,
like a bat or a civet.
SARS in 2003 it went from bat to civet to man, but no matter the implication, it's electrifying since it would mean COVID-19 was already well adapted to human beings from the moment it was first detected in Wuhan in December 2019. And to me, that's more than stunning.
Unlike SARS, in 2003, this virus showed very little, rapid adaptation or evolution in any kind, in the early weeks of the 2019 pandemic, if I recall correctly.
Which clearly implies it was already settled into its final form, and that very strongly implies that the source was almost certainly not via pangolins, aardvarks, anteaters, and probably not the wet markets. So, let's be clear. In the case of SARS-1 in 2003, researchers have already documented the successive changes in its spike protein as the virus evolved step by step into a dangerous pathogen. After it had gotten from bats to civets, there were 6 further changes in its spike protein before it became a mild pathogen in people. Mild. Took 6 changes to get to mild pathogen. After a further 14 changes, the virus was much better adapted to humans. And with a further 4 changes, only then did the epidemic in 2003 take off against humans.
Yeah, and I take it when you look for fingerprints in a similar transition to SARS-2 or COVID-19, a strange surprise, seems to await.
Big time, big time. The virus has changed hardly at all, at least until recently. We had Omicron, and this was admitted, to us by Michael Ryan, the WHO's executive director of health emergencies. Michael Ryan said, and I'll just go straight to his quote because he said it better than me.
Okay.
Michael Ryan said that the patients who died in China tended to be older and that 40% had significant underlying medical conditions, a feature of previous coronavirus outbreaks. He noted that all viruses change, but that this one is showing stability. Quote, "We're not seeing huge changes in the viral genomic sequence," he said. So the source here is a travel ban goes into effect in Chinese city of Wuhan as authorities try to stop coronavirus spread. And that's January 22nd, 2020, and that's from the WHO.
Wait, so from COVID-19's first appearance, it was well adapted to human cells already. And apparently this was admitted by Michael Ryan, a top official in the World Health Organization. Yes. So that's all true.
January 22nd, 2020. I mean, that's pretty early on, Levi. It was November, December 2019. So within weeks of it going, global. So absolutely, the answer absolutely yes. Furthermore, researchers led by Alina Chan of the Broad Institute, which I referred to earlier, compared COVID-19 with late-stage SARS-1, which by then was well adapted to human cells, and found that the 2 viruses were similarly well adapted. I'm now going to quote from the Zahn article, Dr. Zahn's article we alluded to earlier. By the time SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, was first detected in late 2019, it was already pre-adapted to human transition to an extent similar to late epidemic SARS-CoV, which is SARS 2003.
What does this mean in, I guess, in a practical sense, in terms of speaking terms for the origin of COVID-19?
Even those who think that lab origin is unlikely agree that COVID-19 genomes are remarkably uniform. And scientifically, this means, and here I'll quote from an article by Dr. Barak, who concluded, and I quote, "Early strains identified in Wuhan, China showed limited genetic diversity, which suggests that the virus may have been introduced from a single source." And that's Dr. Barak 2020. And the emergence of a highly fit COVID variant, variant 2, COVID-19. And I want the viewers to be aware here, is from the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a top peer-reviewed, arguably the best medicine of a journal peer-reviewed in medicine in the world. So it's a very serious article.
Scientifically speaking, the pragmatic implication here is that COVID-19 was much more likely brought to the market by a person and not an animal.
Correct. A single source would of course be compatible with lab escape, less so with the massive variation and selection, which is evolution's hallmark way of doing business. The uniform structure of COVID-19 genomes gives no hint of any passage through an intermediate animal host. No such animal host has been identified in nature as yet, period.
So we don't know where it came from. Does that imply that the source is still out there? I
Well, Levi,
assume.
that's why we did the podcast. That's the whole point of the podcast. Yeah.
Of course,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, I got you. All right, so then, in the words of the paper's title, a virus could have become well adapted for humans by having spent time in human cells, or is there like a different way?
Another way is in a so-called humanized animal in a laboratory.
Okay.
Humanized animals, usually mice, have had their genomes altered in a laboratory to include a key human gene. In this case, the entry receptor for certain SARS-related coronaviruses.
One second. Like, all right, I think I did get ahead of myself. Like, were there any other prompts that might have triggered this podcast other than what was stated before?
Yes, after COVID-19 hit, later on, there was low-key announcements from the Chinese authorities that no animals in the Hunan seafood market in Wuhan, China, had tested positive for COVID-19.
What is so startling about that?
Well, I mean, it shows this is consistent with the findings of the research articles I've been citing in this podcast. I just cited it, throughout it so far, and it concluded that the market samples are genetically identical to human SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 isolates, and were therefore most likely from human sources.
So then at this point, you no longer believe the communist Chinese government version of this COVID-19 story, that it came from animals sold in the Huana, which is how you pronounce it, the Huana seafood market in Wuhan, specifically bats.
Yeah, correct. I mean, bats, wildlife markets, possibly pangolins, aardvarks, possibly laboratories may all have played some role. But the simple story, the simplistic story of an animal in a market infected by a bat that then infected several human beings is just not credible. And the communist Chinese government has immorally perpetuated this false narrative to this very day, obfuscating the truth at a global level. It's ridiculous.
Why would the Chinese government, or any government for them, or why would a government do this?
After the pandemic first broke out in December 2019, Chinese authorities reported that many cases had occurred in the wet market, a place selling wild animals for meat in Wuhan.
Okay.
Critically, this reminded experts around the globe, it would have automatically triggered a reminder around the globe of virology experts of the SARS-1 epidemic of 2002-2003, in which a bat virus spread from bats to civets and animals sold in wet markets, because the Chinese do eat civets, a feline animal, and it went from civets to people. A similar bat virus caused a second epidemic known as MERS in 2012. This time, the intermediary hosts were camels. So the Chinese government intended to throw this chum in the water, knowing that the recent experience with SARS 2003, with the civets, 2012 with the camels, would veer globally virology experts around the globe down a plethora of rabbit holes leading nowhere.
Was there any legitimate basis for any of this?
Well, I mean, the decoding of COVID-19's genome showed that it belonged to a viral family known as beta coronaviruses, to which SARS-1 and MERS viruses also belong. The relationship would at first glance support the idea that, like them, it was a natural virus that had managed to jump from bats via another animal host, civets and camels, 2003, 2012, to people. But to be crystal clear, the wet market connection, the only other point of similarity with SARS-1 and MERS epidemics, was soon broken. Chinese researchers found earlier cases of COVID-19 in Wuhan with no link whatsoever to the wet market. Other people not connected to the wet market at all got COVID-19 before the people they said at the wet market got COVID-19. But that seemed not to matter when so much further evidence in support of a natural emergence was expected any day now, expected shortly.
Wait, so that happened. This actually happened. I mean, since then, has any evidence turned up of a chain of COVID-19 infections of animal to human in a market, a village, or anything like that? A town somewhere?
No, Levi, not at all. Not one, zero, zilch, nada.
Okay, all right. Let's take a step back here. So currently, as it stands today, why should we as a society, why should we care about the origin of this disease, about COVID-19?
For starters, how the COVID-19 epidemic started, I think, is the keenest mystery of our lifetime. And it's clear it led to the deaths of millions of people, sickened hundreds of millions, and dramatically changed the lives of almost all of us on planet Earth. But at the end of the day, if you don't find out how this epidemic began, you're going to be ill-equipped next time to know when, where, and how the next epidemic may start. So in that sense, I think it's absolutely critical we find out the origins of COVID.
I would just say, like public and media perceptions, were shaped in favor of the natural, emergent scenario, by it seemed the entire global scientific community.
Critically, a group of virologists worldwide, as you said, the global scientific community, and others wrote in The Lancet, a journal, on February 19, 2020, when it was really far too soon for anyone to be sure what had happened. And we're going to throw up on the screen here what they said. And it was statement in support of the scientists, public health professionals, and medical professionals of China combating COVID-19. And one of the authors there, the readers really need to focus on there, is Peter Daszak. Peter Daszak works with EcoHealth Alliance, and he's going to become absolutely critical in this story. And look at the date, February 19, 2020. So this is early on, and it substantiates what you just alluded to.
What exactly is The Lancet? I mean, I know it's a journal, but could you be a little more specific? This is not my world too much.
Yeah. The Lancet is a weekly peer-reviewed general medical journal and one of the oldest of its kind. It's also the world's highest impact academic journal, meaning it's one of the most cited journals by its fellow colleagues, virologists and doctors around the world, and it was founded in England in 1823. So it's as highly respected as a medical journal, scientific journal, as you would find on planet Earth.
What are these esteemed scientists? What do they assert in The Lancet?
We're just going to quote it. We're going to throw up the quote, so we don't need to speculate. We have the article, so let's quote it. We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. Scientists overwhelmingly conclude, don't hypothesize, they conclude that this virus originated in wildlife. It was a stirring rallying call for readers to stand with their Chinese colleagues on the front line of fighting COVID-19. And look at the words they used this early on in the fight against COVID. Overwhelmingly conclude. I mean, I'll be frank, that's just plain asinine, unscientific, stupid, and politicizing something that for which they had no basis. And every author on that article should be shamed.
Yeah, and it sounds like you seem to find this rallying cry, a little premature.
First off, contrary to the letter's writer's assertion, the idea that the virus might have escaped from a lab invoked accident, not conspiracy. This theory surely needed to be explored, not rejected out of hand and mocked. A defining mark of good scientists is that they go to great pains to distinguish what they know and, more importantly, admit what they don't know, being objective. By this objective criteria, the signatories of the Lancet letter were behaving as poor scientists. They were assuring the public of facts they could not know for sure were true, and yet they said overwhelmingly confident. Just horrific.
You said a lot of interesting things there, Emir, but the first thing you said, the very first thing was you said, first off, which alludes that there's another reason that you kind of have against this Lancet article.
True, and it's more ominous. I should have said that the first time, but while we're here, I'll get to it.
Yeah.
And I already talked about this person, and I'm going to be frank, Peter Daszak. He's a doozy, and I'm being kind when I say that. It later turned out that the Lancet letter had been organized and drafted by Peter Daszak, president of the EcoHealth Alliance of New York. Dr. Daszak's organization funded coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. If the COVID-19 had indeed escaped from the research he funded, Dr. Daszak would be potentially culpable. This hyper-acute conflict of interest was not declared to the Lancet's readers, scientists, and esteemed virologists around the world. To the contrary, the letter concluded, and I quote, and I put it up for people to see, "We declare no competing interests." It was a bald-faced lie. It was nothing short of a pack of lies. It trotted around as a scientific conclusion, overwhelmingly conclusive. This is just insanity. So Peter Daszak is a notorious figure in this story, notorious.
If you had to surmise, Like, what was the motive here? I mean, you've kind of baited it a bit. Like, what's the motive here?
The virologists like Dr. Daszak, they got a lot of stake in assigning the blame for the pandemic. For 20 years, mostly beneath the public's attention, they've been playing a dangerous game in gain of function research going on globally that people aren't really aware of. In their laboratories, they routinely create viruses more dangerous than those that exist in nature. They argue they do so safely and that by getting ahead of nature, they can predict and prevent natural spillovers, the crossover of viruses from an animal host to people. So they create or allow mutation. Hopefully they come up with a vaccine. And then if the virus mutates that way, they've got the vaccine. Of course, the pharmaceutical that paid for that mutation has the vaccine and makes a buttload, a ton of, an incredible amount of money. So if COVID-19 had indeed escaped from such a laboratory experiment called gain of function research, which is going on globally and people don't know about it, a savage blowback from the entire planet could be expected against virologists globally not safeguarding gain of function research sufficiently. And the storm of public indignation would affect virologists everywhere, not in China. The MIT technology review editor, Antonio Regalado, said it best in March 2020, and I quote, "If this happened and people found out that the gain of research had gotten out of control and people knew around the world that viruses were allowed to be mutated specifically for humans, anticipating a mutation and creating a vaccine for it, and it got out of hand and slipped out of the lab, quote, it would shatter the scientific evidence from top to bottom." So there's your motive for the hush hush.
It's just a bit surreal. I mean, I never thought things, would get this far. I mean, when news broke in 2019 that, a pneumonia of unknown cause was sending people to hospitals in Wuhan. I remember the footage, I remember the stories. I just figured, the strongest bet was that, it would soon be, brought under control, just as SARS was, in the past, and, had been 17 years before. So it just seemed likely that that was going to be the case.
Frankly, me too. After all, it'd been more than a century since a respiratory virus had caused a global pandemic on that scale.
Yeah, I just remember the initial reports, back in January when it first hit, they were confident that this novel coronavirus was being, caught directly from animals. That was said over and over again.
And like many such zoonoses, at first would therefore not be so easily transmitted from person to person. So any pandemic was extremely unlikely.
Before we go any further, like, what is zoonosis? What was that?
Zoonosis is another name for a zoonotic disease, which is a disease that passes from an animal or insect to a human. Okay. It jumps from animals to us, mankind.
Not only were we, told by the Chinese that it jumped, as you mentioned before, at the point of origin was the Wuhan seafood market in Wuhan, but it was spreading rapidly, which is odd, it being so incredibly contagious.
Yeah. By January 20th, the Chinese government was compelled to notify the world that the virus could indeed transmit between humans.
They had no choice in the matter. Videos of overwhelmed hospitals, as I mentioned already, when the Wuhan, began to leak online, and that was just like the story that just kept getting, pushed out in front of us.
Yeah. They didn't have any choice. There was no kindness on their part. But over the next few months, we learned just how and why COVID-19 was so contagious. Scientists learned that people who just caught COVID-19 and were completely pre-symptomatic individuals could easily infect other people, which is one reason why the mask would not work. One significant reason, they weren't N95 to begin with. But beyond that, by the time you got a symptom of COVID-19, you'd done a lot of your spreading to other people. In other words, you were highly infectious before you had any symptoms at all, which is one reason the masks were not working beyond others. So worse still, COVID-19 could spread via the air. Yet again, another reason making most masks largely useless.
I mean, I'm just kind of like piecing this, all in my head. Like, I keep thinking back to, there's so much information coming at me so fast, but it seems kind of like COVID was geared to spread.
These characteristics are absolutely not typical of a zoonotic disease, one that went straight from animal to man. Today, research and public health experts have described COVID-19 as one of the trickiest pathogens to combat because of these unique characteristics that dramatically reduce the efficacy of standard public health interventions. So
and being so unique, it would seem that the origin of this unique disease, COVID-19, it kind of matters.
I mean, hence, that was the other prompt for this podcast. So that rounds out all my motives.
Yeah. So then to clarify really quick. So if some animal population is definitely out there, carrying this virus, exquisitely adept at infecting people, I mean, I feel like it must be found before it can trigger another pandemic. I mean, I feel like that should be priority one.
Yeah. And if, God forbid, some human practice actually encourages spread, like the farming of wildlife for food, or the disturbance of some natural habitat, or eating civets, you got to stop the practice. Or if some research experiment or fieldwork project had gone awry, lessons must be learned and laboratory practices reviewed globally. If the practice is global, like gain of function research, searching for the origin of COVID-19 cannot, be some idle pastime for a few curious scientists and internet sleuths. It's really a vital task for the safety of humankind. It really demands a vigorous, credible, and evidence-based investigation by experts worldwide. We all got to come together on this.
The issue of an animal being the source of COVID-19 seems to have been resolved since the last 2 years. Tens of thousands of animals, both wild and domesticated. All those animals, they've reportedly been, sampled across China, as far as I know. And not a single animal of any kind has tested positive for COVID-19 so far, unless I'm mistaken.
You're not mistaken. That's absolutely correct. And so I think that leads to the next issue. And a key to this mystery, for me at least, is answering this critical question. Why in Wuhan, of all places? Is that, out of all the cities in the world, how did Wuhan become the original epicenter of a SARS pandemic? Why? Why there? I think at least you got to investigate that question. You have to.
Yeah, I guess I didn't really consider that. So what does make, Wuhan such a unique city? And I imagine you have somewhat of an answer for that.
Well, I think the answer to that question came from an anonymous Twitter user called The Seeker, a former science teacher in India who unearthed a medical thesis in May 2020. And this thesis carefully chronicled the story of miners in the Yunnan province in southern China, near Indochina, who'd been sickened with a mysterious pneumonia after working in a bat-infested copper mine in 2012.
That was in 2012. What follow-up was there?
Researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, led by China's leading expert on bat viruses, Dr. Shi Zhengli, also known as the Bat Lady, mounted frequent expeditions to the bat-infested caves in Yunnan in southern China and collected around 100 different bat coronaviruses. Specifically, in 2013, the Wuhan Institute of Virology team did collect a virus that would later prove the closest genetic match to COVID-19 that we currently have.
Did this lead to any additional research, after all this happened?
Oh yeah, it did. And we're going to put up the article here for the viewers to see. So here's the article. The title is "A SARS-like cluster of circulating bat coronaviruses shows potential for human emergence." And, there are your authors there. I want the viewers to see Zhengli Shi, and right next to Zhengli Shi is Ralph S. Barrick from North Carolina, American. Yeah. His name's already been mentioned. His name will be mentioned again. So please, viewers, make the connection with the Bat Lady, Zhengli Shi, and Ralph S. Barrick from North Carolina. There they are, in 2015, working together. The names will coincide again. Look at how many people accessed this journal article. 2.74 million people, 497 citations by other virologists. So as this article reveals, Dr. Shi, the Bat Lady, teamed up with Ralph S. Barrick, who is an eminent coronavirus researcher at the University of North Carolina. Their work focused on enhancing the ability of bat viruses to attack humans so as to, and I quote, examine the emergence potential, that is, potential to infect humans, of circulating bat COVS coronaviruses. In pursuit of this aim, in November 2015, they created a novel virus by taking the backbone of the SARS-1 virus, 2003, and replacing its spike protein with one from a bat virus. This manufactured virus was able to infect the cells of the human airway, at least when tested against the lab culture of such cells.
If that virus escaped, could you predict its trajectory, like where it would be going?
No, you could not. No.
No?
You
Okay.
couldn't, no more than you could predict evolution. No.
So didn't these virologists, understand like the risks? This is pretty risky, like pretty dangerous.
First off, what they did, known as a chimera, that's what it's called, a chimera, because its genome contains genetic material from two strains of virus. Secondly, Dr. Barak and Dr. Shi referred to the obvious risk in the article. They did refer to it, but argued they should be weighed against the benefit of foreshadowing future spillovers, future mutations. Scientific review panels, they wrote, quote, may deem similar studies building chimeric viruses based on circulating strains too risky to pursue. So they acknowledge, this could go too far. Given various restrictions being placed on gain of function research, which you've already alluded to, matters had arrived in their view at, quote, a crossroads of gain of function research concerns. The potential to prepare for and mitigate future outbreaks must be weighed against the risk of creating more dangerous pathogens. In developing policies moving forward, it is important to consider the value of the data generated by these studies and whether these types of chimeric virus studies warrant further investigation versus the inherent risks involved, end quote.
I mean, from the hindsight of 2021, one could say that the value of gain of function studies in preventing the COVID-19 epidemic, I would say it's like zero. But like the risk was catastrophic if needed, the COVID-19 virus was generated in a gain of function experiment, but it seems like I got sidetracked. I want to come back to the copper mine in 2012, the Yunnan province, I think you said where it was at. What was the research in that? Like what came out of that whole endeavor, unearthing that stuff?
Nothing, zero, nothing.
What do you mean nothing?
Nothing, man. The communist Chinese government will not let anyone near it. Why you've never heard about it. And the WHO hasn't really pushed hard to get there, and neither has any Western European government or the U.S. government.
Wait,
no government has tried to get to that copper mine where it all started, and we can only fathom why.
So wait, how do we know about this then? Like, how do we find out about this copper mine at all?
We know the story of the Mijiangong copper miners only because of the medical thesis written by Li Zhu Lei Shu, and if I'm butchering the name, I apologize, a student at Kunming Medical University, completed in May 2013, entitled, and we're going to show our viewers this, The Analysis of Sick Patients with Severe Pneumonia Caused by Unknown Viruses. The thesis concluded that the 6 miners had been infected by a SARS-related coronavirus from bats, and the author noted that it was essential to investigate the bats in the copper mine.
That sounds pretty significant. Like, why this obstruction for the access of the mine, by China? Like, what's the motive? Like, what could you possibly gain from this?
I would argue the motive is that at this point today, that obstruction amounts to communist China being an accessory to murder after the fact. Whether the communist Chinese government was involved in COVID-19 to any extent earlier than when it was discovered, it is absolutely clear that this is obstruction of justice, making them accessory to murder by not allowing a complete and thorough investigation by concerned scientists, of which there apparently none seem to be organized at any organizational level, at an international level, to actually go to China and get to the bottom of this. I don't know of anyone that's pressured the government, and then the government certainly hasn't facilitated. So, perhaps, let's give the communist Chinese government the benefit of the doubt, perhaps there was no criminal intent before COVID-19 hit, but now today, come on. It's been years and they're still obstructing all efforts to find the truth. They're on the hook, at least for after the fact, at least.
So in the long run, then, I mean, I would hope the truth, will win out. China is only kind of making this whole matter like worse for themselves. Instead, they seem so hell bent on trying to convince the world that, just keep their heads in the sand and convince us all, just go forward, like for a better tomorrow, off there, no worries here, nothing to see here.
Well,
It kind of feels like that. It really does.
This podcast is taking its head out of the sand. Point is, in the spring of 2012, 6 men were admitted to a hospital in Kunming, the capital of Yunnan province in southwest China. Their symptoms were dry cough, shortness of breath, high fevers, aching muscles, headaches, and fatigue. All 6 miners had worked in the same mine in Mojang County, clearing guano up to 150 meters deep in the bat-infested cave. So 150 meters deep of bat poo. 4 of the miners died. The 4 oldest miners died when they failed to respond to a barrage of antibiotics and antifungals.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Emir, these symptoms sounds a little similar, to SARS back in 2003.
Absolutely, which is why these miners, potentially infected by a SARS-related coronavirus in a bat-infested mine, did not go unnoticed by prominent laboratories in China. I mean, China was not stupid to this.
Wait, so, did China respond institutionally specifically? Did they institutionally respond to these?
They did. They jumped on it. They were nervous about SARS 2003 making a comeback. So it drew in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the Chengdu Military Center for Disease Control, which, by the way, is also in Wuhan, China. Surprise, surprise. The Beijing Institute of Pathogen Biology, and even the laboratory of Dr. George Fu Gao, the deputy director of China's National Center for Disease Control and Prevention. The CDC is a network of regional public health laboratories throughout China with headquarters in Beijing. And it's important to remember that Dr. Gao was promoted to director in 2017, 5 years after learning and dealing with what happened to these infected miners, copper miners, in 2012 in the Mojang County, and that copper mine in 2012.
Wait, so to be clear, this incident in the copper mine in 2012, it drew in everybody, in China who was an expert on viruses. Right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
And Wuhan, to be clear, Wuhan is the virology expert city of China. So, but yeah, pretty much. Right. So, keep in mind these facts. We don't know how many men worked in the Mojang mine that April and May in 2012, but 6 were admitted to a hospital. Critical to note, they weren't admitted to a hospital, not to the nearby hospital in Pu'er City, less than a 2-hour drive away, nor were they admitted to a hospital in Yoshi, less than a 4-hour drive away. Rather, these infected miners were admitted to the hospital in the provincial capital of Kunming, almost a 6-hour drive to the north. These 6 men had been administratively referred there by their local hospital and clinics for specialized treatment at the Kunming Medical University Hospital. Soon thereafter, all the experts in virology in China had something, they knew something was wrong. Yeah. And this was known at an institutional level, especially in Wuhan. So China is known to having known institutionally in 2012, and that specifically includes the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There's no arguing about this.
Okay. By the reaction by the hospital administration, it's clear to, at least to me, that something was a little bit of a miss. But other than the reemergence of SARS, was there anything here particularly unusual?
The Wuhan Institute of Virology mounted at least 4 different expeditions to the mine, and at least 3 more in the subsequent 2 years. So in my mind, something other than your typical SARS was going on, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, by their actions, indicate they were extremely concerned, and they thought something unusual was going on. The reaction by the Wuhan Institute of Virology is that they had encountered something utterly new. SARS, not from a civet like last time, but now it was from a bat in a copper mine in Yunnan near Indochina that had infected men directly with no intermediary hosts, no snake, no wet animal sold in a wet market, no civet, No animal intermediary host at all, direct from bat to man in 2012. That would have been startling, unbelievably unique to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in 2012.
So I guess the reaction by the Wuhan, sorry, I want to make sure I say it correctly, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. God, it's a long name. All right, but it was so strong that if you are right, Emir, if you're right, the Chinese are trying to have the first ever recorded case catching a SARS-like virus directly from a bat.
Yeah, exactly. Remember, it was the Wuhan Institute of Virology that had successfully tracked down a reservoir of SARS-like viruses, very similar to the one that had caused the 2002-2003 outbreak. In a horseshoe bat of the species Rhinolophus sinicus, type of bat, in a natural cave also in Yunnan province.
So what was the practical results of these efforts then, by the, I wish I had an acronym for it, but the Wuhan Institute of Virology, in terms of the scientific community, like what came of that?
After sampling hundreds of bats from the Muzhang copper mine, Dr. Xi's team discovered a single novel SARS-like coronavirus, SL-CoV, in 2013. They published a tiny part of its genomic sequence. Why only a tiny part is another mystery, but a tiny part of its genomic sequence in 2016 under the name BT-CoV, bat coronavirus /4991, and that's going to become very important in this story. It was found in a subtly different species of horseshoe bat from the one that by then was known to to harbor the progenitors of SARS. But this bat, unlike the bat in SARS that did the SARS 2002-2003 epidemic, this bat in the copper mine was the Rhinolophus affinis, the intermediate horseshoe bat, as opposed to the Chinese horseshoe bat Rhinolophus sinicus, which is the SARS one in 2003.
The bat related to SARS 2003 breakout, right?
Yeah. Then years later, in November 2020, Dr. Xi, the bat lady, revealed that at least another 8 SARS-like coronaviruses had been discovered in the Muzhang mine by her team in 2015.
That's kind of astounding to me. I mean, it's pretty incriminating for a leader of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to not publicize their findings for what was like 5 years, 5, 4, 5. Yeah.
I mean, especially when COVID-19 had apparently originated a few city blocks from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It comes out a few city blocks away, and now you're telling this something you discovered 5 years ago. There's just too many coincidences here. The bat lady's full of bat guano. It's ridiculous.
I mean, if this finding, if appropriately published, I think it would have set like the scientific community, in virology, on fire, around the world.
It should have, but the lack of fanfare regarding these new SARS-CoV viruses or new strands of coronaviruses is extremely puzzling. Keeping in mind the mysterious SARS-like illness that had afflicted the workers in the mine, which we referred to earlier, the BT COVID /4991 sample should have been of immense scientific interest, meaning it should have been, and normally is, published immediately with full disclosure and transparency.
Yeah, so here was like the SARS-like virus from a horseshoe bat found at the site where 4 people had died from SARS-like disease.
Yeah, the oldest.
Yeah, it was exactly what the expeditions to the mine have been seeking. So why not just be fully open to the scientific community about that? These results that they found here. Why not just do that?
I don't know, but Dr. Xi's 2016 paper made no mention of the miner's death. It was left to readers to connect the dots by connecting this paper, this article, to the Muzhang miners.
All right, so so to be clear, okay, when and where did the Chinese officially first encounter COVID-19?